As we continue to look at the shroud, so far we have seen a number of key things. We saw that there were pollen traces and traces of spices and flowers that are only found in the Jerusalem area. That pollen from near the head traced to a plant that could have easily been fashioned as a wreath of thorns. There was a separate head cloth called the sudarian that is also stained with the same blood type. And any dating methods that resisted a first century origin for the shroud have been dismissed with new evidence. This next movie will review even more evidence, and we will trace the shroud back in history while learning more about it. And we should note that this film was created by the very skeptical BBC, that currently has all of their religious programming run by a Muslim.
The Shroud of Turin is about to be examined in a way it has never been before. The most famous thing about the shroud now is that it is a medieval fake, and not the burial cloth of Christ as millions of people have believed. That was the verdict of a carbon-14 test done exactly 20 years ago. But the irresistible force of science seems to have hit an immovable object. New evidence has appeared which contradicts the results of the carbon-14 test. So, why won't this image of a naked and battered man just lie down and die?
There's one very good reason. No one has been able to work out how the forger did it. No one, despite many attempts, has been able to produce an image with the same physical characteristics. It's a mystery.
And into this vacuum has rushed a new and for many unthinkable question. Is it, after all, not the shroud that may be found wanting, but the carbon-14 test applied to it?
On the 20th anniversary of that test, physicists are preparing a new carbon-14 test. It will show if the original carbon-14 test could have lied. So just what is the new evidence relating to the Shroud of Turin? And could it resurrect the shroud as the most potent relic of Christianity?
I'm embarking on a journey that will span 3 continents and take me to the very heart of Christian history, and to the people that have closely examined the shroud. Turin sits in the plain at the foot of the Alps in northern Italy.
This is the home of the Shroud, the Cathedral of John the Baptist.
Well, this is quite a moment for me. My first awareness of the shroud came when I was at school in the 80s. A lot of new research appeared to hold out the prospect that it was indeed the most important relic in Christendom. The last time the shroud was shown was in 2000, and it's not due to be seen again until 2010 at the earliest. Visitors have to make do with the sight of its fireproof case. But already there's a surprise in store. Something remarkable has just happened. News has come to me from the Cardinal Secretary.
The Cardinal has agreed for its veil to be lifted for us.
In this side chapel, the windows are being blacked out and the humidity and temperature carefully measured.
Under considerable secrecy, this room is being prepared so that our camera teams can film the shroud for the first time in high definition.
While the preparations take place, I want to understand the key features of the shroud. The first thing that strikes you is that since the carbon-14 test, the church makes no claims for its authenticity, but it does maintain its importance as an object of devotion. Behind that glass and beneath that cover lies the finest Italian engineering, designed to keep it safe and in an atmosphere of inert gas, monitored minute by minute. Professor Bruno Barberis is the curator of the museum dedicated to the Shroud. And a visit to the museum begins with a film. An intriguing revelation is that throughout its history, the Shroud has often been displayed in public. It may seem like a trivial detail, but it could be important to the investigation. Could the Shroud have been contaminated in any way and so distort its true age? Another relevant detail is that artists have tried to imagine how the cloth must have been wrapped around the body to create the image of the front and back. The answer could shed light on the age of the cloth. In 1532, a fire melted the metal box in which the Shroud was kept, and it left behind a geometrical pattern of burns. Miraculously, the image was preserved intact. And finally, a piece of information that goes to the heart of the debate over the age of the Shroud. All we can know for certain is that before Turin, the Shroud can only be reliably traced back to the village of Lire in France, where it was in the possession of this man, Geoffroy de Charnay, who first exhibited it in 1360. That date is very significant because carbon-14 dates the Shroud at 1325, plus or minus 65 years. It all seems to check out. My first impression of the Shroud, then, is that, on the face of it, it would make sense to dismiss it as medieval forgery. But as I'm about to discover, there is more, a great deal more to this cloth than meets the eye. The day for the filming has arrived. These will be the first high-definition moving images ever taken.
We are turning over. We're running up.
To protect it, only the minimum amount of light is used. It took me a while to pick everything out, but then it became quite clear. Lying between the geometric patches from the fire, the image of the front and back of a man's body, with what seem like scourge marks, and the very specific wounds of a crucifixion. The cloth itself is about 4 meters of linen with traces of cotton. It has a distinctive herringbone weave and the scorches from the 1532 fire. These show it was once folded in 48. And another curious set of L-shaped scars show that at one time it must also have been folded in 4. These observations could be important. This is the image the Shroud reveals to the naked eye. But with the help of some technology, the eye can see more. By first removing the color and then reversing light and shade, we create a negative of the image. Photography first captured this a century ago, but today it can be done at the press of a button. This is a clearer image of the figure on the cloth. This is the true positive. It's the image on the cloth that is in fact a negative.
This is the camera which revealed to the world a much clearer image of the Shroud. In its negative form, the Shroud was somehow more recognizable and easily discernible. And what's more, photography meant that the image of the Shroud could travel far and wide, and interest in it began to grow around the world.
For believers, the appeal was irresistible. The Shroud seemed to hold out the promise of a tangible contact with Christ himself at the crisis of his suffering on the cross. And here were the key identifiers, the wounds from the lance in the side and the crown of thorns. But carbon-14 ended that hope, and many religious hearts were broken. A couple of generations have since grown up knowing almost nothing about the Shroud, but whatever the result of the carbon-14 test, the Shroud has remained an enigma.
And the enigma is this: if the Shroud of Turin is a medieval fake, then how exactly was the image forged?
Lying in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains in the United States is Colorado Springs. It's the home of the man who has studied the Shroud closer and longer than anyone else. John Jackson is a doctor in cosmology and lecturer in physics. Together with his wife Rebecca, he runs the Turin Shroud Center of Colorado.
The first thing we come to is a photographic model.
Through his research, he has had one of the few full-size, high-definition still images of the Shroud for some time.
That exists anywhere in the world for scientific.
In 1978, when interest in the Shroud was at its height, he led a large team of scientists to Turin, where they examined the Shroud for a week. No one since has secured such full access to the cloth. Significant amounts of different types of data were extracted. Jackson became the primary custodian of this data, and he has continued the work. Only now does he feel ready to share his findings exclusively with us. Unlike everyone else, Jackson wants to solve the riddle of the Shroud. If it's a 14th century forgery, then how was it done? Could a medieval artist have created the distinctive properties of this image? The first thing Jackson established is that the cloth can be wrapped around a body. The bloodstains on the back and front of the cloth match exactly where they should.
Place it over the three-dimensional man that we have here. Now, I'm going to pull this intentionally straight. And I would like you to notice, first of all, that this blood stain right here which is this at the bottom of the feet, is totally...
It's hanging off the end.
Yeah, it's totally off image. Look what happens when we make the hands align properly. Yeah. Look now what happens to the blood stain at the bottom of the cloth.
That matches.
Roll it back.
It's exactly where a nail would have been.
Once key features were aligned, everything else fell into place, even the stains from one end of the cloth to the other. If we're dealing with a medieval relic, then it's one that's been meticulously created. And we know that the bloodstains are not paint. Jackson's team identified it as blood in 1978. But what of the image itself?
The image on the Shroud has some very interesting characteristics to it, and these are not only interesting, but they're scientific characteristics.
The simplest hypothesis is that the forger painted the image. The proof would be the presence of a medium to bind the pigment. We are going in now to a close-up of the darkest part of the image, the nose, and further to a microscopic picture of the same area.
The image is only on the surface fibrils of the cloth. These fibrils, which are on the order of the size or the diameter of a human hair. These are the fibrils that are twisted together to make threads. If you look, these fibrils are individually colored. They bear that color that is the body image at the microscopic level. Notice that those fibrils are not cemented together by any kind of paint. What we see, and this is the observation microscopically, is that the individual fibrils of the shroud are colored.
To get a better understanding, we need to look at the cloth sideways on. If we magnify its thickness, we find that the fibrils that bear the image are literally just on the surface. Nothing has seeped into the cloth below.
What this observation does, and this illustrates the scientific method, is the hypothesis of an artist using a pigment that has some viscosity to it is excluded, I believe, by this singular observation on the shroud.
If the image is not a painting, Jackson considered the idea that an embalmer subjected a real body to the horrors of crucifixion and then wrapped a cloth around it. But a simple look at the image of the face shows that contacts between the body and the cloth alone could not have formed the image. The eye sockets and the other recesses of the body, as well as the hair at the side, would never have been in direct contact with the body. And if they were, the resulting image would look like this. If the image is a fake, it can't be the work of either a painter or an embalmer. Of course, the carbon-14 test still points to the shroud being a medieval relic. But Jackson has identified two properties of the image that a forger would have had to reproduce, properties that only modern technology can detect. The first is the fact that the naked eye only sees a negative image of the body.
This is important because if we're going to think of the image as being the work of an artist, then it would seem that what you have to deal with is the idea of somebody composing the image in a negative reverse to the way we normally see a human being and put this onto a piece of cloth, a long piece of cloth, with a technique which also has definable characteristics. And this is a very difficult thing to imagine. You have to remember that whoever would have, or hypothetical artist, would have not had the luxury of being able to check his work.
The second unique property of the image is one discovered by Jackson himself, its three-dimensional quality. He discovered from his experimental wrappings that the intensity of the image varies with the distance the body is from the cloth. The tip of the nose, for example, is darker than the hollow of the eye. I wanted to know if we could see this with our new high-definition images. And sure enough, with the simplest press of a button in our editing suite, this 3D quality is revealed.
I was astounded when we were able to do this, that the brightness surface that you create by the computer looked, as you can see here, very much like a three-dimensional person, particularly the face. If you look at the facial structure, you've got the nose in proper relationship to the cheeks, which are in proper relationship to the eye sockets and so forth.
These special properties of the cloth narrow the options. Maybe the forger was a sculptor. A medieval technique for creating both properties is bas-relief. A sculptor creates a 3D model in stone or metal. To transfer the image onto the cloth, the bas-relief is heated and the cloth placed over it long enough to be scorched. It's an option that Jackson has experimented with. The real test of this method is whether the heated sculpture can scorch an image on the surface and only on the surface of the cloth.
So I used that, making a hot bas-relief, trying to impress that on the cloth. And yes, you can get some images that could have some pseudo three-dimensional quality and also a high resolution. But the problem there is that to put a surface discoloration on the cloth, on the fibrils, heat will discolor through the thickness of the shroud in about, it's about 1/100th to 1/10th of a second. So you would have to have the bas relief on the cloth and take it away on a time scale like that in order to be consistent with what we observe. So it just goes on and on. But problems that just don't seem to work.
To avoid this problem, some tests have daubed paint to transfer the bas relief onto the cloth. The result does show some negative and 3D qualities. The trouble is that they are distorted and crude. Also, this method uses paint, and the absence of any evidence of a binding medium on the cloth does rule that out.
I must say that that anyone who wants to try to explain the shroud image, and this work needs to continue, most definitely, but one has to make sure that you're working on a hypothesis that can explain the totality of all image characteristics, and you can't just go and pick and choose. You can't pick and choose what you want, and that's all too often what happens.
Science says the shroud is a 14th century fake, but so far, no one has found a medieval technique to accurately reproduce the image.
No wonder the fascination with the Shroud of Turin continues. The search for a method of creating the image on the shroud will go on. But in the meantime, the failure is raising a new and controversial possibility. Is it possible that the carbon-14 test itself was in some way flawed? It's a possibility that's gaining currency because there is new evidence that places the Shroud of Turin earlier in time. Historians have identified another Shroud of Christ in the 12th century in Constantinople. And what I want to know is if this shroud could be the same as the one in Turin.
If it is, it would push the date of the Turin shroud back by at least 160 years and challenge the accuracy of the carbon-14 test. The evidence for a 12th century Shroud of Christ surfaced recently in a document called the Prey Manuscript. It's in Hungary and takes its name from the scholar who first examined it. It can be reliably dated to 1196. This is one of its 5 illustrations, and it shows Jesus being placed in his burial shroud. Mechtild Fleury-Lemberg is a textile expert who is charged with preserving the fabric of the shroud. She studied these images of Christ in the manuscript and identified a number of features that reappear on the Turin shroud. The most obvious is that the figure on the shroud has the arms crossed and the thumb hidden under the hand.
On the top you see the painting with the corpse laying on a white linen, as one would expect, which is normal, a white linen. And you see the arms crossed, and you see the 4 fingers. The thumb is invisible, is hidden, and that is also a connection. It's also visible the same on the shroud.
Lemberg is also very aware of the geometric weave of the shroud.
What is more important for a textile historian, as I am, you see painted herringbone pattern. And this herringbone pattern is a typical sign of the Shroud of Turin.
Another feature of the cloth are the holes bunched together in an L shape.
These holes here, these L holes, they are on this picture and they are on the shroud 4 times because it was folded in 4 layers. You see here small holes, a little bit bigger, and then here you see the bigger ones.
Oh, I see.
The painter of this picture must have seen the Shroud of Turin. Otherwise, it's not possible because it's exactly the signs which we find also on the Shroud in Turin.
If the carbon-14 test is right and the Turin Shroud dates to the 14th century, then you wouldn't expect to find the same arrangement of holes in a shroud nearly 2 centuries older. And yet that's exactly what the Pray manuscript shows. So, if the shroud now in Turin was once in Constantinople, what was it doing there? And more importantly, why do we not hear from it again until 1360? Well, this isn't Istanbul, the modern Constantinople, it's Oxford. And I've come here to speak to a man who's made the study of Christian sacred images his life's work. Constantinople had the finest and most prized relics in the world.
This is the piece of the 12th century.
Professor Alexei Lidov has made a study of a rare memoir of a French crusader who hunted down these relics and gives us this intriguing account. It is set in Constantinople in 1204, around 10 years after the date of the Pray manuscript, and it mentions a shroud of Christ displayed in some kind of ceremony in which the shroud with its figure of Christ was raised up every Friday.
I quote, "Amongst others, there was another of the churches called Our Lady St. Mary of Blacherna, in which was the shroud in which our Lord was wrapped, and which stood up straight every Friday so that the image could be clearly seen on it."
What does he mean by the image or la figure was lifted up?
A kind of rite or a special ritual happened every Friday in the Blacherna church related to the demonstration of the Shroud of Christ. It seems to me very probable that the Constantinopolitan Shroud and the Shroud of Turin is one and the same piece, because of very rare similarities and this extremely important evidence by Robert de Clary that there was an image of Christ on the shroud.
As for why we don't hear of this shroud again, the crusader Robert de Clary tells us in his memoir that at the end of the Fourth Crusade, when Constantinople was ransacked by French crusaders, no one knew what became of the shroud. But we do know that the Turin Shroud's first recorded appearance is 150 years later in France, in the hands of a familiar figure, one Geoffrey de Charnay. Recent research has found that he was married to a direct descendant of one of the leaders of the Fourth Crusade.
If a French crusader took the shroud from Constantinople, it would explain why we only hear from it again in the hands of his heirs. But although the shroud disappeared from view for 160 years, Professor Lidov believes a memory of the image on the shroud was preserved in the art of the period. This icon of Christ is known as the Man of Sorrows. It became popular in Constantinople when the shroud disappeared. It has many of the distinctive features of the image on the shroud of Turin, the crossed arms, the hidden thumb. And significantly, it depicts an image of Christ emerging out of a box-like tomb as if raised up from the dead. Many different versions of it exist. It was clearly a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus and almost certainly invokes the ritual involving a shroud described by the crusader Robert de Clary. I wonder if its origin might be connected with the loss of the shroud in some way.
I think so. In a way, we may consider this as a kind of compensation of this great loss and the commemoration of the presence of the shroud in Constantinople.
The Pray manuscript, the testimony of Robert de Clary, and the Man of Sorrows icon all build a compelling case for the Shroud of Turin being older than the date specified by the carbon-14 test.
It's a controversial claim, but it seems to be supported by an intriguing series of features, now clearly revealed by high-definition images of the shroud. When lit from the side, the shroud image all but disappears, and from the shadows emerges another dimension, the cloth's accumulated folds. Watch again what happens when the lighting changes. Notice the horizontal creases the whole width of the cloth. Linen has a kind of memory. It creases, and if it's kept folded for long periods, these creases become permanent and a record of how the cloth has been kept. According to Dr. Jackson, it's data that can be used forensically to link the Man of Sorrows icon to the shrouds of Turin and Constantinople.
Next time, we will pick right up where we just left off and see how those folds let us trace the shroud back even farther in time.